This is our final video lecture on our theme of death in music. We've been looking at the ways that composers handle this theme of death in music. How do they write about death in a way that's different from other themes? We've looked at some of the compositional techniques that they've used, as well as some of the symbolism that occurs in music that relates specifically to death. So, for example, we looked at how when notes go down, when they descend, that often has to do with death, this sort of sinking, like going into the earth. And we saw that this week in Dido's Lament from the operas Dido and Aeneas, how the bass line goes down. Okay, so there's this sinking feeling. We actually also saw this last week in our theme of love in music when we looked at Schumann's Dichterliebe. Remember, that's the song cycle that had 16 songs, and the very last one was the one where he's building a coffin so he can bury his love, and in that he sings lower and lower and lower. And so it's the exact same effect, talking about death, talking about going into the earth, the notes actually going down. We also saw this in Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, the last movement, where the violins have the melody, and then the cellos have the melody, and then the basses have the melody. So again, it's just going down and down and down. So that's a compositional technique that composers use when they are talking about death. Another one is using this two-note couplet that I call the lament figure that we saw in Dido's Lament, again in that bass line. Those two notes, kind of sort of sighing or crying. That's very common when talking about a sad topic like death, is to have that kind of two-note crying figure. We also saw that in Mozart's Requiem, in the Lacrimosa. Right, in the violin part, this very sad kind of a crying sound. And we talked about how the brass section, so an actual instrument family, usually specifically the trombones, often depict death. That whenever the trombones are playing by themselves, it can be a symbol for death or maybe just fate or something sort of very serious like that. There is another symbol that has everything to do with death in music, and it also has to do with your extra credit for the week. The last two letters of your extra credit are A and E. A as in alpha, E as in echo. Okay, put that with the other letters that you have, and that spells out the Latin for day of wrath. Wrath as in W-R-A-T-H. It's the first four letters make up one of the words, and then the next four letters make up the next word. And day of wrath is, in music, a hymn. Right, now we know what a hymn is. We came across it in John Tavener in our week on church music. A hymn is a simple tune, simple song. And this hymn just basically is equated with death. Like whenever you hear this hymn, the music has to be symbolizing death in some way. And it sounds like this. That it's very ominous sounding. It's in a low register, it's in a minor key, right? So that kind of fits with what it means. And composers use this all the time when talking about death. Berlioz in Symphonie Fantastique used it not in the movement that we discussed, but in the fifth movement of the symphony. Remember that we looked at the fourth movement where he's guillotined? Well, in the fifth movement, he attends his own funeral, and multiple times the orchestra plays that hymn. This hymn is also used in movie soundtracks to symbolize moments of death. And I put a clip on Canvas for you of a montage of different movies clips when it's used this hymn. You don't even have to, it's not necessarily the whole hymn. Even if you just hear just even the first part, that's enough. That's enough for the music to mean death, mean day of wrath. And finally, you may recognize this hymn if you've ever been to a college football game. I imagine a lot of you are college football fans, and it is very common for a marching band in a college football game to play this hymn, to play the Day of Wrath hymn. I guess means like this is your final day, like we're gonna get you where you're going down, this is your day of wrath, and we're gonna kill you. So marching bands play this all the time. The next time you sit down to watch a football game, or if you go to a college football game, listen for the marching band and listen to see if you can hear them play this hymn, because they do it all the time. So that is yet another symbol you can add to your list of symbols and compositional techniques that are related to death in music. Now, I always like to take the opportunity at the end of a theme to discuss what we've learned maybe about death from music, just like I did when we talked about love and music. And if you remember, when we looked at love, I talked about how you probably expected the music to sound all happy and positive, you know, the buds are blooming and the birds are chirping, and the music really wasn't like that, right? The love in music had some really dark elements, and in fact, we could have taken those pieces that we studied in love and music, you know, Dicta, Liebe, Berlioz, and we could have studied them this week, because there was actually a lot of death in love. So we chose to study them last week, but we could have studied them this week. Now this week the music was a little bit more, or maybe let's say less surprising in terms of how it sounded. The music was in a minor key for the most part. It generally sounded sort of sad or dour, but not all the time. And there were some good things in it as well. Think about Dido's Lament. She's in love with Aeneas so much that she has to end her life because she can't live without him. So there was love in Dido's Lament, and we could have taken that piece and studied it last week with our theme on love. So the idea is that these things that we think of as good and not good actually maybe have a little more of a gray room, particularly when music and art are dealing with it. Another example of that is going to be the Mozart Confutatis, which is the first section that we listen to in Mozart's Requiem. So that's from this week. The Confutatis starts out really sort of aggressive and really intense. Really, really intense. It's in a minor key. It's very stormy, very turbulent sounding. And then less than 30 seconds in, it suddenly changes, and it's women singing in a high register. It sort of sounds like angels. It's in a major key. It's very smooth and lyrical. And then it goes back to that sort of stormy minor key, really intense sound. Oh, and then back. And it goes back and forth. The Confutatis has this back and forth throughout it. And I think that is maybe a great way to summarize not only this week, but the past 2 weeks. Showing that these topics aren't just simple, straightforward, good and bad, that there are more complicated elements to both of them. And in the case of death, that's an example of acceptance of death, of the inevitability of death, the fact that it's going to happen to all of us, and there can be a calm about it. There can be an understanding of it, that it's sort of part of life. So I leave you with that. Hope you enjoyed this week on death and music.